Hello guys, and welcome to this new video. I haven't uploaded a servicing video for a little while, and I decided to squeeze this one in between the other bits of jobs that I'm doing. This is a recent acquisition which I picked up from an auction, and I just couldn't resist it. It was advertised with problems with the chronograph running, which it did have, but as you can see here, with a little bit of poking, of just initial poking before filming this, it's not anything that's insurmountable, and thankfully the movement, which is a lovely caliber 865, is complete and intact. The auction did not show movement pictures, so I was a little bit concerned initially, but very pleased to see that everything is where it should be. Here you see a close-up of the movement, and up here where I point out with my pegwood, you can see what appears to be a stress crack in the top of this coupling runner for the coupling clutch, and that was initially my thoughts. However, it appears that this is in fact correct, and you'll see later on as we disassemble this and you see the underside what I mean, and also compared to other parts, because obviously I did look at sourcing a replacement part before discovering that this was clearly intentional. So there you can see the operation of the chronograph, and the way it works is you press the button to start, you press again and hold it in to stop the movement at wherever you've stopped it, and then you release the pusher and the hammer will drop back onto the heart and reset it to 0 to the 12 o'clock. Down here I'm pointing at the pivot jewel for the pallets, because it seemed under magnification that there was a lot of wear in this jewel and the pallet fork was slopping about quite badly. It actually transpires that it was nothing but dirty old lubricant and just the play of the light, thankfully, so the jewel itself is in good condition. So here we begin by uncasing the movement. There's two movement casing screws with a little tab, as you can see there, and there you can see I perform a bit of magic and make one disappear and reappear again. Thankfully it didn't go too far, and there's the little tab that holds it in place. Next we remove the stem by unscrewing the small screw which goes into the setting lever. Just about one and a half turns, draw out the stem, and then we can uncase the movement with a gentle tap to encourage it out. It's obviously not been outside in a while, like most of us during COVID. And there you can see the case. I will disassemble that later, removing the pusher button so that I can replace all the seals and what have you. I'm just replacing the stem at this point. Which will then allow me to set the hands into a suitable position for hand removal. The casing ring just lifts away, as you can see. It is a little dirty, but not too bad. And here once again you can see the operation of the chronograph, and then press and hold and then release to reset the sweep seconds hand. There you can see I've removed the sweep seconds hand using a Presto tool. These can be notoriously tricky to remove. Many chronographs have the seconds hand pressed on incredibly tightly, and unfortunately it is very easy to damage the seconds hand or the pipe, or quite often separate the hand from the pipe. In some instances it can be staked back on, in others, due to previous damage, it's just simply not possible. And ordinarily when such watches will go back to the manufacturers, they would just have a replacement seconds hand fitted. This is common practice for most large manufacturers. and there we can see using hand levers removed the hour and minute hands as normal, and then loosening the 2 dial screws opposite one another, we can gently pry away the dial. For this I use one of my hand levers. These are one of my all-round favourite tools, and they have so many uses. They make fantastic pry tools, and with the underside of them being polished smooth, it leaves minimal risk of damaging anything. So there you can see the dial and its very distinctive dished shape, and the rear of the dial with the dial feet. Here I'm removing the foil or the dial washer, the hour hand and the cannon pinion, again using a Presto tool for this. The next step is to release the power from the mainspring, and something here is a little sticky. You could probably just about see there that the stem actually has corrosion, and there are some dirt when the main plate comes off that you will notice around the area where the stem, the keyless works are, which indicates that a little bit of corrosion has gotten in there. So that was a little bit sticky, but we did release the power. And the click, as you could see there, was quite hard to get to. Here I'm going to remove the balance cock, and at this point, after removing the screw, I've actually changed to a conventional holder. Now, a conventional movement holder is something you won't see me use very often in my videos, for the simple reason that I really like my 3D printed holders. Being plastic, they can be printed to the precise size of the movement. They grip the movement incredibly tightly, and I just like the way that they work. However, in this case, I really needed that extra little bit of space to get the leverage to begin lifting the balance cock, at which point I just kind of left the movement on this holder and continued with the disassembly. So the first things we start to disassemble are the chronograph works. Here I'm just relieving the tension on the hammer return spring after unscrewing it slightly. I then continue to unscrew it fully and lift away the spring. This just helps to stop things pinging and flying across your bench, never to be found again. And there I was just about to replace the screw after discovering, or before discovering, that there's a cam lever spring underneath the hammer return spring, which mounts in the same location as you can see there. We then replace the screw. This is something I do on most Swiss chronographs, unless a chronograph movement is a very simple one, such as, for example, the Seiko 6139, where there are very few screws and very few components. With Swiss chronographs, manufacturers have a tendency to really mix and match their screw sizes with shouldered, non-shouldered, different lengths and all that kind of thing. So I find the easiest method, unless they're all very dirty indeed, is just to replace the screws for the components as you remove them, and then that way there's no way of getting mixed up. The hammer, as you could see there, just lifts off of its post, and here we're removing the chronograph runner cock. There's a prying point at the rear there where my screwdriver was. Unfortunately, there isn't one at the front, and this particular one proved to be a little bit reluctant to come away. And after a bit of wiggling and prying and poking, what I decided to do was remove the pallet fork for safety, as you can see here. This is always a good idea on driven chronograph movement, because it's easy to knock the wheel on the extended fourth wheel pivot or similar and bash the escape wheel against the pallet stones. So it's always a good idea to get this out of the way. There, I'm just freeing up the pallet cock before lifting it away. As you can see, the pallets came away with the pallet cock. This is always a sign of the pallet pivots having been oiled. And as you can see, that's well and truly stuck in there. And what I'm doing here with the pallets out of the way is using an old oiler, which I use as a general poking tool, and fitting that underneath the front and applying a little gentle pressure where my thumb is just at the bottom of the screen that you can't see. I'm using again the hand levers as a prying point, and this is allowing me to apply pressure at the front and the rear, minimizing the chance of me breaking the chronograph runner pivot. And with a bit of judicious wiggling, as you can see, that just pops off. The end result being a nice clean bridge and an unbroken chronograph runner pivot, which is precisely what we want. You can see the two locating posts in there, and that's the reason that this is such a tight fit, and obviously those are essential for keeping that bridge in precisely the correct location. The chronograph runner then lifts clear. That, along with the rest of the train wheels, will be inspected closely later. And you'll note there the chronograph runner spring, tension spring, actually has free movement, and that's interesting. We'll look at that in a moment. Here, similarly to the hammer jumper spring, I'm relieving the tension on the coupling runner spring. And then a little bit of gentle persuasion, and that comes away. And as previously, the retaining screw is refitted. The next to be removed is the coupling runner itself, noting that the securing screw is the large one next to the driving wheel and not the slotted one up at the top. That's actually an eccentric, which is there specifically to allow you adjustment of the coupling, the meshing of the fourth wheel and the coupling runner wheel. And that will be disassembled further later. The little bridge will be removed, the wheel removed, and the jewel holes pegged and cleaned. And of course, once again, the coupling, the securing screw is refitted. Here I'm removing the extended fourth wheel pivot driving wheel, and as you can see, it's somewhat reluctant to come away. I do like to use hand levers for these, and they generally work very well. And there is a specific Presto tool designed for this. I don't have one of those. I really could do with getting one at some point for when I do encounter reluctant ones such as this, and that allows you to ensure that you're applying exact even force, but you can use hand levers with great care. What I decide to do there is leave that until I've got the rest of the chronograph components out of the way so that I can focus on that a little bit more closely. So the next thing to be removed here is the cam, which operates the hammer and the coupling clutch, or allows them to engage. This is in two parts, as you can see here. And you can also see another eccentric screw. They're quite unique on this movement in that they are slotted and they have flat sides, so they're very, very easy to spot, which is nice. It's all too easy to accidentally turn an eccentric screw with chronographs when you're not familiar with the movement. So with the screw for the cam refitted, the next item for removal is this lever. Here I'm just using a bit of pegwood to maintain a bit of tension on the spring while I lift this piece away, and then the spring underneath just lifts from its post. This piece here just sits in the notch and is held in place by the spring and the lever that you just saw me remove, and that's essentially a free floating piece. It allows it to move in every direction that it needs to during the operation. This is connected to the start lever. This lever I'm removing here, which sits above the start lever, is the one that holds in place the hammer during the reset. So while the button's pressed in, it remains forward, and the little hook at the end hooks a lug which sits on the hammer, and you can see a little tab underneath which bears on a spring which is just behind where I'm refitting that screw. You'll see that removed in a moment. And that little tab at the end, a little hook at the end, holds a tab on the hammer, and once you release that and it lifts up, it allows the hammer to drop and reset the seconds. Next we'll remove the start stop lever, and that's held by 2 screws and is free sliding. And you'll see here I remove the screws and then I'm checking to see if that's actually engaged with the spring underneath before I lift it away, just in case I pull that away and the spring flies out of its housing. And as you can see, it's actually free sliding, so it's the tension acting on it that drives it back to the reset position. So that lifts away with its quirky little operating lever, as you can see there, and as before, the 2 securing screws are refitted. And that one, as you can see, is reluctant to leave the tweezers. There's quite a little bit of old oil and what have you. It's not exactly huge amounts, probably a little more than there should be, but it's no doubt over the years there'll have been a bit of oil creep and what have you. Here I'm removing the spring that was mentioned a moment ago, and very simple design, much like a setting lever spring. And then the chronograph runner tension spring, which is held by a small screw which is shouldered, and what this shoulder allows it to do is swivel freely, which is really nice to see because these are normally fixed in place, and getting that screw tightened down and keeping that forked tension spring precisely in place can be very tricky. So this solves that particular problem, which is nice. Refitting them is generally fiddly at the best of times anyway, but I do like to remove them completely when I'm stripping a watch because they are quite fragile, so I tend to hand clean those. Finally, we're left with the driving wheel on the extended 4th wheel pivot, and here you can just see a little bit of a close-up of the 3/4 bridge showing the sort of oil and grease residue. As you can see, there's a little there. It's not too bad as things go. I've seen much worse, and case in point is the Omega 1045 Speedmaster movement that you saw in my recent video. That thing was absolutely flooded. And there you can see more clearly the click now that the other chronograph components are out of the way. Here I'm returning to using the hand levers, and after about a minute of very careful poking and prodding, this did pop off nicely for me, as you can see. And what I'm doing here is just showing you the extended pivot on the fourth wheel, just to show how why it's so important to lift these off as directly upwards as you possibly can, because any bend on there will translate to the driving of the chronograph and bind up even the slightest bend. Here I'm removing the escape wheel bridge, or escape wheel cock technically, because it's held by a single screw, doesn't actually bridge the component, and that's very straightforward. The escape wheel is then lifted clear, and at this point I'm just checking the shakes of the train, the end and side shakes of the train, using a piece of pegwood to manipulate the exposed part of the second wheel there, and then with fine tweezers to allow me to get in and under the bridge, I check all the side shakes and end shakes of the various train wheels. This is always a good point during disassembly to see if there's any obvious and really bad wear. Often, depending on how old and how dirty the watch is, you'll need to do at least a basic hand cleaning and then a partial reassembly of the bridge and the train components to check for wear, because quite often old grease and dirt can obscure wear which is not apparent on first disassembly. There I'm just checking the barrel arbor by wiggling the barrel at the side. The barrel arbor is the small piece at just there where my pegwood's going, where I'm cleaning away a little bit of excess grease which I can see at the top of there, before checking that again to see if there's any obvious signs of wear. So far this one doesn't look too bad at all. For an old watch which has a bushed barrel arbor and a bushed second wheel, or rather a second wheel mounting which is direct to the main plate, it's really not bad at all. Next for removal is the 3/4 bridge, which covers the mainspring barrel and the entirety of the train. Sometimes these also cover the escape wheel, which forms part of the watch's escapement. So this bridge is held in place by 3 screws. Here I'm removing the screws and laying them out side by side so that I can check to see if any are of a different size. Some movements do have one size which is different to the others and will always be in a specific location. Because this is a movement I've not disassembled before, I wanted to check and make sure. And then after a little bit of judicious levering, I'm removing the main plate, the 3/4 plate there rather. And there I'm just resetting the train wheels and the ratchet wheel back in place so that you can take a look and see how those sit. This is a close-up of the 3/4 bridge of the underside, and you can see the dirt and the hints of corrosion that have crept in through the stem. Thankfully not too bad, very easy to clean up. And there's the main plate showing the excess grease on the ratchet wheel and the train of wheels. Here I'm removing the crown wheel. This is held by a screw on the top and a small central disc underneath, so holding that with my finger I remove the screw completely, which hops out and into one of the other holes, which you can't quite see there, and is initially a little bit reluctant to come out of there, but once I let that drop onto there you can see it pops out, and there's the holding plate which sits underneath, which is stepped so that it fits into the crown wheel, which as you can see also has quite a bit of grease underneath it, but again not too bad. A little bit of wear on the plates, but not anything horrendous. And next is the train of wheels, starting with the second wheel, the third wheel, the fourth wheel carefully because of the extended pivot, which you'll see on both sides. The ratchet wheel, which sits onto a square of the barrel arbor. On your typical manual wind watch, this would actually be on top of the bridge rather than underneath, but it's quite common to see them underneath on chronographs. And then the mainspring barrel, which I've just refitted there to give that a little bit of a wiggle and a shake to check the barrel arbor side shake at the other side, which again seems quite good. Once more, here's a close-up of the plate showing the dirt on the jewels, which is fairly common to see, but other than the dirt they look in quite good condition. And there you can see the winding stem and the corrosion and a little bit of encroaching corrosion in there. Back round to the underside, and we remove the setting lever spring, which is held in place by 2 screws. This also forms the cover plate for the minute wheel, as you can see. And with a little bit of encouragement, this pops off. We then remove the minute wheel. You can see a little bit of dirt under there also, but again not too bad. Here we've got 2 intermediate gears, and one of these has in the past been fitted the wrong way round. It doesn't matter greatly, but on one side of these there's a chamfer which acts like the sink of a jewel. So the oil sink of a jewel allows the oil to be held in place, and it's the same principle with these. And usually if there's a chamfer on one side, that is fitted uppermost to retain lubricant on the post. Because these don't get excessive use, it's not really too essential. There I just removed the spring, and as you can see the yoke, which it sometimes helps to attack from different sides, as in that case because it was quite firmly stuck in place on the pivot. And then here I'm just flipping the movement over so that I can remove the setting lever screw, at which point the setting lever will fall underneath, which it just did there, but obviously you cannot see that as yet. I can then lift out the setting lever screw, which also has a little bit of corrosion on it, but again not too much, and that will clean up. The stem of course will be replaced, and then here I can just draw the stem out and allow the winding pinion and the sliding pinion to drop underneath. Turning it back over, you can see the various components just there. The next step is to replace the balance. In preparation for cleaning. This will be hand cleaned initially, and I do this in a spirit jar with a soft brush and pegwood if there's heavily stained parts, but that really tends to be on the really heavily stained vintage movements, which have been sat in a drawer gathering dust for 30 or 40 years, and giving that a little wiggle as I'm tightening it down to make sure that the pivots are free and not binding up anywhere. And prior to that going through the cleaning machine, the chaton and cap jewels of the balance will be removed, but the balance left in place. Here I'm removing the barrel lid to remove the mainspring. you can see that this is also being very reluctant. This is probably one of the most awkward barrels I've ever had to open. Normally the lids pop right off. The only exception being the over the side type that Seiko use, which have to be pried apart. But this one was very reluctant and took quite a bit of wiggling and poking before it finally gave up and popped off for us there. So once I've refitted that, I will have to double check the end shake of the barrel arbor carefully, as it may have domed the lid ever so slightly on opening. Next, remove the barrel arbor. You'll note the mainspring coils into the left because this barrel is fitted, technically speaking, upside down from where I have it at the moment. And here I'm just releasing a few coils of the mainspring before unwinding that nice and steadily. This doesn't always go to plan. Even now there are sometimes mainsprings which just have a life of their own and decide to leap out in one go despite you holding them. And there's the mainspring barrel. There's the spring, which doesn't look too bad, but the inner coils are quite tightly wound together, and you'll notice the very end of the spring doesn't look quite right. And that's because part of the tail that holds it in place is still in the mainspring barrel, so at some point that has snapped off, and that could potentially have had the spring slipping around the barrel, scratching up the barrel walls, but thankfully that doesn't seem to have happened. And of course a replacement spring is on the way.